Hi there, everyone. Okay, well, welcome to the Centre for Visual Cultures, first of all. This is our first event of the year, and we're delighted to have Mandy Merck, Professor Emerita of Media Arts, Royal Holloway, for our first event. And it's great to have you all here as well. We are recording this event, and if it is the case that you have to leave a little bit early, it'll be available to upload, and I'll give information about that after the event in an email. For those of us who don't know Mandy, and I can't think there are any, to be honest, know Mandy and her work, what I thought I might do is just highlight some of Mandy's publications. And I can't include them all, obviously. There are so many. But I'll just highlight a number, beginning with Perversions, Deviant Readings, 1993, a monograph. Coming Out of Feminism, 1998, accredited volume. After Diana, 1998, an edited volume. Another monograph, then a key monograph from Mandy, Hollywood's American Tragedies, Dreiser, Eisenstein, Sternbeck, Stevens, 2008. The British Monarchy on Screen, 2016, an edited volume, and most recently, Cinema's Melodramatic Celebrity, Film, Fame, and Personal Worth, that's just come out with BFI in Bloomsbury. Came out last month. So we're really delighted to have Mandy's sort of fresh work off the press, and for Mandy to be here to be talking about what is actually one of the chapters in the study. So that's what we've been reading in the material that I circulated. And the title, as you know, is The Drama of a Recognition, City Lights, and Celebrity. I hope you got a chance to at least dip into it for our session. And just a spoiler warning in terms of the session, we're not showing, this is not a kind of film talk around clips. We will hopefully have one clip. But it's not that sort of film talk or film lecture. It's much more a kind of seminar discussion, working across disciplines. So Mandy in film, Danielle in philosophy, critical theory, and John in German cultural studies. Just to introduce John and Danielle in more formal terms, and that is John, who is reader in German and cultural studies here at Royal Holloway, and also Danielle Sands, senior lecturer in comparative literature and culture at Royal Holloway. So an interdisciplinary dialogue is what we have designed this event as, and the Centre for Visual Cultures is very much part of that conversation across disciplines. So in terms of the format, what we're going to do is to, first of all, go through some slides with Mandy, which will give us some of the theoretical terms used in the chapter. And then we're going to go to John first, who will be responding to the chapter, focusing in particular on Chaplin and also comparable films in German cinema. Comparable to City Lights. And then Danielle will be exploring the more philosophical aspects of the chapter, in particular Honneth and Ricoeur. But the idea is that once we've done that, we have a discussion and then everyone who is here can participate. And hopefully everyone will be able to speak and at least be able to speak through the chat. And if people want to put their hand up, obviously we know what the etiquette is on that with the virtual hand, but also through the chat, alert me, I'll be monitoring that throughout and make sure that everyone has their question noted and explored. Okay, so shall we begin?
Great. Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to now share my screen, which gets us to the PowerPoint. Okay, so Mandy, over to you.
Okay. this chapter is from this new book of mine, Cinema's Melodramatic Celebrities, which deals with the issue of how fame is narrated in the cinema, and particularly its generic relation to the individual's search for moral recognition in melodrama in particularly. In the case of fame, or celebrity, as we call it when we disapprove of the famous person, that recognition is both cognitive and evaluative. We recognize stars when we identify them on the screen or on the street, and we morally value or esteem their star qualities, their beauty, their talent, whatever. And of course, these are contestable terms themselves, just like celebrity is. What troubles so many commentators about all this is the problem of the multiplying effects of recognition, that people can become, quote, well-known for being well-known, or famous for being famous, as Daniel Bornstein famously complained in 1961. But as the ref continues to demonstrate, recognizability itself can be taken as evidence of significance and esteem, not least via citations like the one I've just made to Bornstein, a hugely influential sociologist whom I don't esteem at all. So what does this film tell us about the many meanings of recognition? For those who haven't seen it, City Lights is a slapstick melodrama. It's subtitled A Comedy Romance in Pantomime, and my paper clearly ignores the comedy. The film opens with the dedication of a civic monument to peace and prosperity. Can we have slide number 2?
Okay, I'm just getting there, Mandy. I might have to go to play first and then back, okay? Because it seems to be blocked here. Just give me a moment.
Okay.
Oh dear, what's going on here? Sorry.
Yes, bear with, no problem. There aren't that many of these.
Why is it not going forward down here? I'm sorry.
This is the last slide you've got up, James.
Oh, that could be why. There we go.
Yeah, backward.
Okay, here we go.
That's 1, now to 2. Yeah, great.
That's where we start in the film.
There you see the opening of City Lights. The little tramp is discovered when they unveil the statue for its dedication. This homeless man, ironically enough, asleep on a monument to peace and prosperity. Right, so they chase him away from the monument. He walks the city streets and pauses, can we have the next slide, before the arresting sight of a second sculpted woman, a nude in an art dealer's window. And sculpture is a big issue in my book, and it's quite a big issue in this film. These two statues of women anticipate the Pygmalion role that the tramp will play in the life of the next woman he meets. And next slide, please. Billed as a blind girl and selling flowers. Now, it's worth noting that in an intensification of the typification of melodrama casting and character drawing, these characters are named as types, not as people in the cast list. The tramp is called the tramp. The blind girl is called the blind girl. The next character we're going to meet, can I see the next slide, please, is called an eccentric millionaire, but he's better known as the drunken millionaire. And he's come to this river embankment to drown himself, right? And the little tramp pulls him out of the water, persuades him that life is worth living, and they go off to spend a bibulous night together, right? Eventually, the tramp, they wake up, the drunk is still drunk at this point, happily. When the tramp admires his goals, he gives it to him. And he gives him enough money to go back to the flower girl, who is already impressed by giving her a tip. And the tramp suddenly picks her up in the rolls with all the flowers, delivering the flowers, and impresses her far more with this impersonation of a rich man. But when the tramp gets back to the millionaire, this time he's sobered up, and in sobriety, he fails to recognize the tramp throughout the story. So the film operates a rhythm of recognition and rejection, and it climaxes with the millionaire giving the tramp money for an operation to restore the girl's sight, only for him to be caught up in a burglary attempt and convicted of the theft of the money. But actually, what he's done with the money is he's delivered it to the girl before he's caught, and so she is able to keep it, and he goes to jail and is in jail, as far as we can tell from a montage of calendar pages, quite typically, blowing away in the wind for about 9 months. He emerges from jail even more pallid and bedraggled than the tramp is typically in Chaplin's films. And he walks slowly and seemingly painfully down the street and bends over to pick up a flower in the gutter. And in doing so, while he does so, 2 newsboys torment him and sort of pull his handkerchief through the ragged hole in the back of his trousers, which are virtually falling off. Watching them and laughing from the window of a smart shop is a florist. ... Okay, so I just wanted to go through the terminology of this. Can I have the next slide? And why it relates to melodrama, and then we can talk about it. In melodrama, the gestural performance of pre-revolutionary theater is retained. And pre-revolutionary theater, and here I'm thinking particularly of the French Revolution, but there's an interesting question of what constitutes revolution in these accounts, which are very indebted to Peter Brooks. In the theater of France before the Revolution, and at about the same time in the UK, theater was licensed, and people could not perform dialogue plays without having a suitable royal license. Most popular performance was without, therefore, dialogue play types, and instead played up pantomime, acrobatics, magic shows, animal training acts, and so forth. This gestural performance was arguably retained after the Revolution abolished the licensing of the theater and let everybody perform dialogue plays wherever they liked, in a retention both of the use of pantomime and gesture while declaiming lines or in between declaiming lines, as well as a high imperative of physical characterization in casting and in performance. Notable actors in early French melodrama performed the same type of role over and over again. If you were an innocent ingenue, you might do it several thousand times. If you were a villain, you might do that several thousand times, and you'd be known for that. The fact that you were in the role would help the audience, who were largely unlettered at this point in the early 1800s, would help the audience to understand who is the good guy and who is the bad guy, in a kind of basic configuration that leads us to the idea of the good guy in the Western and wearing the white hat and the bad guy wearing the black hat. And white, pretty staggeringly racist terms are used to characterize innocence and villainy at this period. Okay. Now, what Christine Gledhill has gone on, taking Brooks and Elsesser, to say is that film stardom continues this identification of the actor with the role in typecasting and in a high level of moral implications in the choice of actor in the role. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Melodrama borrows a good deal of its poetics from the classical writings of Aristotle in particular. Aristotle called a scene of dramatic recognition occasioned by a revelation, the most famous being, of course, the revelations of Oedipus's parentage, and anagnoresis, a change from ignorance to knowledge. What melodrama tries to make us know is the moral worth of a poor or abused protagonist. And Peter Brooks talks about this as virtue made visible, the drama of a recognition. Now, the interesting thing is the question of what recognition means, because celebrity itself is a synonym for recognition, and so is renown and reputation and regard and so forth. And they're terms which combine a cognitive element of being able to identify somebody with an evaluative one, approving of them, esteeming of them, or regarding them at least as important and significant. And as recognizability, celebrity practically combines both elements. Okay, next, please. Next slide. This is just a further point on the terminology of the classical period. In addition to anagnoresis, there is aletheia, a related term from classical poetics, talking about literally an unveiling, and we've seen the terminology of unveiling in this film being literalized with the unveiling of the statue and the revelation of the tramp, a disclosure. Okay, next, please. City Lights has a high level of identification with the protagonist and the actor, because he wasn't just the performer. He wrote, Chaplin wrote it, he directed it, he produced it, he started it, and he claimed to have written all the music, as he did for his other major films, but there was a contest about the key violin piece claimed by the actual composer, which perhaps Chaplin inadvertently recalled and imagined he'd written himself, but in any case, he didn't write quite all of the music. Right. Okay. Now, in the film, no one knows the little tramp, and although we may recognize Los Angeles because of its famous boulevards, it's not identified as a particular place, but we do know Chaplin. In fact, we couldn't fail to know him. He wasn't just the most famous film star of this time. He probably was the most famous person in the world. Right. Okay, next. There are some German terms for recognition that are relevant to this argument. Erkennen means identifying someone as a particular individual, the kind of identification I've talked about, or realizing what's true and what's false. Wiedererkennen means to recognize again, and I've misspelled that there. I think it's I-E, not E-I. And anerkennen means something different. It means the granting of a certain status and public recognition in the sense of esteem. It relates to standing in a community. It's not about identification in terms of picking someone out. It's about how much public approval or importance they have. Okay, next. Paul Ricoeur picks up Axel Honneth's interest in these terms and develops them further using French terminology. And the particular term that's important in his working out of what he calls the course of recognition is the French reconnaissance, which means to grasp an object through thought, to understand it in some sense, to accept something, to take something to be true, to acknowledge it, if you like. And this important third element, to bear witness through gratitude that one is indebted to someone for something. Okay, and one last point on this. This is from, I think it might be slightly obscured by the bar there. Is anybody pulling that up a bit? If not, I'll read it. It's from Siegfried Kracauer, talking about, I think it might need to go the other direction, but maybe we can't do that. Kracauer is talking about Chaplin, and he's writing in 1931 when the film has come out. And what he says is, more than a few artists, statesmen, inventors, and researchers have achieved fame. But while all of them may have achieved recognition, and there he uses aneracant, right, as in the terminology of public recognition, esteem, status, not all are actually recognized, erkannt, as in being able to be identified. And then he says, Einstein, referring to the scientist, Einstein's name is perhaps more famous than any other, but his teaching is the secret property of only a few. Here Chaplin parts from the rest of the famous, he's saying. He is understood by the poor and the rich, the great and the small, in every country. So here we get a fairly complex mixing of terms of a recognition, which produce the dilemmas I wanted to focus on in this little paper. So that's the prelim from me. Thanks.
Okay, great. Yeah. Thanks, Mandy. And then pass to John for his response. John?
Thank you, Mandy. Thank you, James. I said to you, Mandy, just before we started, that I was delighted that you'd written on city lights, and I really enjoyed reading the chapter. I look forward to reading the whole book. It's a film which has always interested me, actually, perhaps along with Chaplin's later modern times, as what seems to me a key cinematic response to the city. And I've taught for a few years a course on representations of the city. I've never included this film, but I'm thinking, maybe Chaplin ought to figure somehow. Clearly, it was a preoccupation for him. I was reminded, in a way, of certain German precursors, particularly Murnau's city films of the 20s, such as The Last Laugh and Sunrise, as well as the poetic city symphony tradition. And in a way, maybe he's sort of Chaplin is keying into that, looking backwards at those films from the previous decade there. I mean, The Last Laugh from 23, I think it is, Murnau's film, is an interesting comparison for sure, because it's a film which also hinges on moments of recognition, and is also a narrative which depends on types. I mean, famously, it doesn't really use intertitles, and the characters are simply presented as different types. And the key moment in the film is when the central character, who's lost his job and been stripped of his uniform as a hotel porter, is recognized out by a neighbor. And this moment of recognition is cinematically presented as a moment of shock and drama and horror, even horror. So I was reminded in different ways of that particular film. Emil Jannings is the star of that film, and Jannings is interesting because he looks so different in each film. He's almost unrecognizable from one film to the next. Whereas Chaplin, of course, is always exactly the same. Everything we have to recognize Chaplin. That was the selling point, really, and that's this conflation that you mentioned between character and star. And just building up to a couple of questions for you, Mandy. I have to say that one of my other interests is cultural responses to sport, and in that respect, City Lights is also a favourite film of mine. The boxing sequence is certainly one of the funniest depictions of boxing from this period. And Buster Keaton also made a film that revolves around boxing, but that choreographed scene in which the two boxers dance around the referee is just brilliant, and slapstick perfection, I think. You didn't focus in your chapter on the slapstick, but it's obviously important. It's important to the momentum of the film, this sequence of slapstick moments, and that for me is the best of them. Interesting also that this film dates to the first year or two of talkies, and it's also the moment in which Chaplin declares his allegiance to silent cinema. And the pantomime tradition that you were talking about, it's an extraordinary thing to have done, actually. Just while all the other major stars and studios and directors are trying to adapt to this new technology, he pretty much says it's not relevant to me. And maybe that relates to this question of his universal recognizability that you discuss with the Tramp, and that Krakoa touches on. The Tramp is somehow recognizable to everyone, regardless of culture and language and so on. And that obviously the advent of the talkie, the sound cinema, potentially jeopardized that. So he simply chose not to do it, which is an extraordinary thing, and continued to do that. And I was certainly glad to hear of the European reception of the film. Very interesting to hear of the European reception of City Lights through Krakoa and Freud. I wasn't entirely surprised to hear it wasn't that successful in Germany, actually, because I know that this was the era in which talkies had really taken off, and it was homegrown films primarily, and European films that German audiences were flocking to see in that period. Which didn't stop Chaplin being this iconic figure for those intellectuals like Krakoa. And I've read many sort of journalistic feuilleton type pieces from this period, the 20s and the 30s, which are devoted to Chaplin. And he was, he's an important figure, I think, for that sort of liberal, artistic, cultural scene in Germany. So I'm just going to move on to a couple of possible talking points and questions. The themes of recognition and misrecognition made me think that the film, in a way, could be seen as a sort of riposte to the rags to riches myth, which was so often associated with America and with LA, perhaps in particular, with the movie industry in particular. And the film seems to work through these familiar scenarios from that rags to riches tradition, which goes all the way back to Cinderella and fairy tales. So the millionaire benefactor, which you come across in other stories as well. Also, boxing is often represented in these terms in this period. It was a means through which someone from the bottom rung of society could elevate themselves potentially, and Chaplin has that, or the Tramp has that moment of where he might also have this opportunity, at least of earning some money, but he fails to grasp it. And again, he has these opportunities to reverse his fortunes and fails. He's always returned to almost where he started. And I wondered if that was a key to, well, if that relates, in fact, to the way Chaplin is seen. If he was transformed in any way, he would no longer be himself. He would no longer be that little tramp. And I was reminded a bit of Renoir's film from 1932, I think it is, so more or less the same time, Boudou Saved from Drowning, in which a tramp is rescued. This time it's the tramp who's rescued by a wealthy family, and they try to sort of transform him, and they fail because he's somehow too much of a wild or free spirit. He can't be civilized. Whereas in Chaplin's case, or in the case of the little tramp, he's simply too recognizable to be transformed. The figure has to be maintained. And And I wanted to ask something also about the end of the film, but I wondered, Mandy, if you had any thoughts on that. This sort of circular, almost reversing his fortunes, but always returning to where he started in the film.
Mandy, you're on mute.
No, I think, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Good.
Well, it's a perennial issue in his films of this period, getting the big chance and then, in some sense, refusing it even. I mean, I'm thinking about The Circus, which Germans did like just 3 years or so earlier, perhaps because they like circus films. And they seem to like genre films a lot, because 31, when we get to City Lights, they were very, very taken with waltz films. And this is the period where the Victoria and Albert stuff starts getting going as well. And then a German star is brought over to England to continue his life playing Albert, the poor man. But basically, in The Circus, what's interesting is that he's only a success when he doesn't know that he's performing. And the joke is that the ringmaster has to make the other people in the circus keep him from being aware that he's actually supposed to be being funny, because he can't be funny intentionally. He can only be funny by accident. Yeah. And there's a tremendous reflexivity going on about Chaplin's success. And in The Circus, of course, when he's invited finally by the girl he loses, as he loses them all, to join the circus nevertheless, and even ride in a very interesting kind of childlike relation with her and her husband, the wire walker, to join them in their own wagon in the circus as the circus leaves town. He chooses not to, and we think he's going to get into the last wagon, and he doesn't get in at all. So there's a sense of rejecting the brass ring a little bit going on in this narrative of trying for success and failing. And it seems partially because the tramp seems to himself to have a certain kind of gentility and a certain kind of resistance to dominance that gives him not quite the subordination that he might otherwise have. So he already has a certain kind of American success within the terms of the psychology of the country. He won't take it when people tell him what to do, and he won't be made to be someone, even if it is himself in the circus. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah. His manner and the fact that he's never really dissatisfied with his lot. He's rarely really seeking to improve himself or to transform himself, is it? I mean, he's looking for money to help someone else at one point, but it's not for himself. So John, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Do you know which films were the most successful in 31 in Germany? Because I do know from reading Garncarts and from reading other stuff, some of the films, I mean, 31 was the year that Threepenny Opera
yeah, but it was. I mean, I think some of Pap's films were successful. I'm not sure that one was one of the most successful. I have a feeling one of the most successful films that year was Drei von der Tankstelle, which was a drama set in contemporary society dealing with unemployment, and that was certainly a very big film that year. But also, as you say, these waltz films and historical melodramas and comedies were all, farces essentially, seemed to be quite big at this time. So not necessarily the films that we remember, from this period of our cinema, were the ones that were attracting the biggest audiences. Year before this, we have, the Blue Angel, or the but again, I'm not sure that was a huge hit at the time, compared to some others. And that was another film with Emma Jannings, of course. Also, somehow recognition also seems relevant there. But Could we talk a little bit about the end of the film before maybe we pass over to Danielle, who's going to pick up on some of these philosophical questions? And I wondered if maybe people would like to see the 2 minutes from the end of the film, because it's such a striking and in a way quite strange couple of minutes that are right at the end of the film. So shall I just try and share my screen and we can pick that up? I found it on YouTube. That's just seemed the easiest way to...
Sure.
Yeah, here we go. So this is the last couple of minutes.
The music keeps playing right through.
Okay, John, are you?
Yep, I'm
okay.
back there. So I kept it going right to the end then, because of course there's this fade to black which you mention in the piece, Mandy, which is so interesting. And your analysis of it, I thought, was compelling, relating it to the way in which it's about spectatorship, and there is a screen there which divides them, which is quite interesting. And I was struck by the way in which it's about simultaneous or a sequence of moments of recognition, of misrecognition. And the first of them is when the now not blind girl, the flower girl, is miraculously restored to vision. Apologies. There we go. So she recognizes what she thinks is, first of all, the type of the tramp. She doesn't recognize the man she knew, but she recognizes simply a vagrant, a tramp, a type, and for her that's simply nobody. I mean, she's quite patronizing in the way she initially engages with him, because she effectively thinks this is nobody important. And then comes this moment of recognition of or Wiedererkennen, to use that German phrase, where she touches him and recognizes the physical individual that she knew and remembers his generosity. So there's memory in play. But is there a third moment of recognition? Maybe this, I'm not sure if it's cognitive or an evaluative recognition, where she realizes at this moment that he's lied to her. It's a recognition of a deceit at the same time, because she was expecting a millionaire, and there is this moment where she sees the young millionaire, wonders if that might be him, and what she sees is someone who's quite different. So she both recognizes him and remembers him at the same time as she's recognizing or realizing that she doesn't know him, that she's been lied to. And I was just wondering if these ambiguities, as well as the fact there is no final embrace or kiss between them, there's no romantic fulfillment at the end, is that deliberate? Is this sort of hedging at the end? It leaves us sort of hanging slightly, doesn't it?
Is this to me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, there is always the question of the tramp's pretensions to gentility or to a success outside his class having to be refuted, regardless of how much we like him. So yes, there is a certain possibility of deceit, right? Well, he's blatantly deceived her all the way through. From the moment she hears a car door shut when she first meets him and thinks it's his car, and he realizes that suddenly and sees the advantage of that for himself, he's able to, I guess, simply get to know her by being accessible, because he might be a potential benefactor. And in fact, he is a literal benefactor. There's no deceit. He has saved her sight. That's the ultimate irony. He hasn't deceived her at all. He has suffered to save her sight. but he is not of the class she is expecting. So in that sense, there is a kind of deceit. But there's also, I think, her sense of her self-deceit. And I think in some sense she reproaches herself. One of those 4 looks that she gives, if you try to break them down bit by bit by bit, seems a look of almost, oh my God, I made a mistake, in a way that seems to be her reflecting on her own error and maybe her own unreasonable expectation that aid can only come from somebody who's posh. Yeah, I mean, that's probably stringing it out rather more than could have, but you know what I mean. There's a sense of a flicker of almost guilt. Yeah, and that facial expression. Everybody is self-deceiving, perhaps, in their pretensions and their hopes. The resolution that we want is that they could love each other, as we want the tramp to be loved by the aerialist in the circus or whomever. But we know they can't be, because the reassertion of class is very, very strong. You know, for a leftist, he's in a very strongly stratified position that he can't escape, really, and that his films won't allow him to escape either. So I like the idea of fading to black to prevent us from having any kind of resolution of what could happen between them. But I think we strongly know nothing is the answer beyond some kind of fleeting friendship. Yeah.
Okay, Mandy, that's great. I think, looking at the time, maybe we should now move on to Danielle, and we can come back to some of these points a little bit later. Over to you, Danielle.
Thanks, James, and thanks very much, Mandy. This was super interesting for me. Film is not what I work on, so it was a really interesting sort of challenge to move me out of my comfort zone a bit and think about ideas in a slightly different way. What I want to do is just think about recognition in relation to the Honeth and the Recur text that you mentioned, and sort of reflect a little bit on some of the ways you use those texts in the chapter. And I'm not going to speak for very long, so we will have some time to discuss. The appeal of the concept of recognition lies in its connection to a profound human need, or rather set of needs, including dignity, integrity, and respect. Equally, its employment responds to a recurrent philosophical and political dilemma. Does one start with the self and move to the social, or vice versa? Mutual recognition, at least in Axel Honneth's framing, sidesteps this question. The key elements of the self-relation, self-confidence, self-respect, and self-esteem, he contends, can only be generated and sustained intersubjectively. Self-respect guarantees one's entitlement to equal status, whereas self-esteem acknowledges one's particularity, resulting in recognition both as an equal and as an individual. The ethical force of mutual recognition derives from this. One cannot effectively become an autonomous self without it. Now, in Mandy's account of City Lights, it doesn't simply perform various modes of recognition or misrecognition. Rather, it advances our understanding by interrogating some of these modes. And I'm quite interested in thinking about, I guess, the ways in which different media can make us think about recognition in different ways. So Honneth distinguishes between different types of recognition: emotional support, which is basically love and friendship; cognitive respect, which is legal rights; and social esteem, which is sort of community solidarity. Now, the complex intersections between these are foregrounded in the film, which demonstrates, for example, the difficulties in clearly delineating human value from social status. So at some points it follows these categorizations, and at some points it disrupts them. This serves to emphasize the vulnerability of the human subject, which is something I think comes out through all of these accounts and in the film, and to show that the inescapability of human dependency reinforces the need for recognition. The plural definitions of recognition provided by Honoth and Ricoeur afford varied points of access onto city lights. As Mandy's chapter notes, failures of recognition are initially framed as limitations of knowledge or perception. So the blindness or the drunken man. However, the assumption that recognition is largely an act of cognitive grasping or knowing is frequently undercut by the film, which variously frames recognition as a mode of feeling, hearing, imagining, or as we've talked about in relation to the final scene, touching. And just looking at that final scene again now, I noted that she touches him and then she touches herself. So there's something really interesting about the order and the dynamic there. Similarly, the alliance between recognition and evaluation, which underpins the othering of the tramp figure, is offset by an alternative account of recognition, which seems to perhaps suspend judgment. So Mandy draws on Ricoeur here in the chapter, and his discussion of bearing witness through gratitude, that third one of those definitions, to explore this notion of recognition. Here, giving is not commensurate with commercial exchange. There's no expectation of reciprocity or payment. This spontaneous generosity as a model of recognition is incommensurate with grasping or knowing. It is not a mode of classification. I think that's really interesting. The idea of something, some kind of recognition which can avoid classification or identification in these ways. In teasing open the idea of mutuality, and this is something that happens right at the end of the Ricoeur book, and sort of leaves it open, I think. Ricoeur insists upon, quote, an asymmetry that mutual reciprocity doesn't eliminate. He means, in short, that the other always remains unknown and unknowable. And he's saying here that recognition must account for that in some way. And I think here he's deviating from Honoth, or he's doing something slightly different. And I think it's really interesting that this is the spirit in which Mandy closes the chapter, or rather resists closing the chapter, by insisting that there is no simple resolution either between competing definitions of or competing claims for recognition.
Mandy, you're on mute.
Yeah, that's lovely. I appreciate your efforts to strand those strands. And I like the way you started with the self and the social and the irresolution on Honoth's part of which is the determining factor in self-definition. But I suppose that might be going back to the Hegelian ambiguity about those as well, which he does try to take account of, as well as the psychodynamic point. There's a very nice line that I put in the footnote from Judith Butler that says something about the acquisition of recognition. Let me see if I can find it. It's in the footnote somewhere. Oh, yes, she says, to solicit the recognition of the other, is not to confirm an already established identity, but rather to transform oneself within that interaction. Yeah, which follows the Winnicottian idea of the mother and the child figuring out who they are by their interaction with each other. And I suppose going back to this for this seminar and looking at some of Chaplin's other films, I do talk about his infantile status in the film in various ways. He is in a maternal lap from the beginning of the film. But there is a strong sense of the development of the child in this tale, and where the child's selfness comes from, the question about that being worked out. And at the same time, there is this very, 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 very durable star persona of chaplain, which is already baked in, as they say in the United States, to a very considerable degree. And what can be done with it in the 60th incarnation of the tramp, that would register the social or the external on the on self-esteem or self-respect. And for me, that registration of the impact of circumstances, I suppose, comes from the way he's made up and costumed at the end of the film, which is so much more old and tired and sick than he ever looks in, I think, any other moment of dire straits in his movies, even when everything goes wrong. And I thought, in some ways, this might have been the point to abandon the tramp as a character, really, because in some sense he's dead at the end of this movie, it seemed to me, or the possibilities are dead. But he's revived as the proletarian tramp in modern times. Did he need to be the tramp to make that work? Is an interesting question. Maybe he did to make the film financially viable. Yeah, but sorry to pull that away from the philosophical. I loved your point about the flower girl touching herself after she's touched him, and the act of touch as it. I think people knew by the 30s the idea that supposedly, and this is in a lot of movies, blind people recognize other people not by their voice, but by some form of tactile engagement with them. I suppose there's also an idea of blindness and deafness going together, and of course, we are deaf in this film. There is no vocal capacity for recognition. If it was not a silent film, so-called silent film, it wouldn't be possible. So I liked your comment about that, and about its self-established, the way that it establishes the selfness of the flower girl as well. This tactile sense, finding herself, identifying herself in that interaction. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Can I just pick up on one thing? I'm just looking at that Butler quote in your footnote.
Yeah.
And the quote is, to petition the future always in relation to the other. And there's a moment in your chapter where you talk about trans-temporal recognition. You pick up on the recur.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether you could speak to that a little bit more, because I thought it was really interesting.
Well, recur is thinking about something that interests me as somebody who's interested in the way melodrama borrows plot lines from the classics. The moment in the Odyssey when Odysseus comes back to his home disguised as a beggar, or as some kind of old, crusty, vagrant, and only his dog initially recognizes him. And then he talks about, and of course, Odysseus would have been 20 years older and quite messed up by circumstances, one imagines, after the Odyssey, not to mention the previous Homer work, and then he switches to Proust and talks about something that is, if you're my age, is enormously familiar experience, which is when you meet some people you haven't seen for a long time, and you're not sure that you for a moment you're not sure who they are, then you do recognize them, and what Proust says is time had given them disguises, but not the disguises one wants when one goes to a posh ball. It hasn't made them more beautiful, it's made them less good looking in very dramatic ways. And then Recur says, there's this question of who the person is that you see again after 20 years. And they look different. They are different. They are significantly different. Are they the person you knew before? Are they the same person in some sense? And he says memory makes them both other and the same. Yeah. And he talks about a trace, memory having manifesting a trace, which is very like the arguments for the indexical trace, I thought, in the cinema. And he nearly gets quite cinematic at that moment, which wouldn't be wholly surprising because he's writing, well, his formation is so contemporaneous with that kind of thought, whether it's Peter Wallen or Christian Metz or so forth. And he certainly would have met at least one of them. So I liked the way that the past and the present are compacted in the act of recognizing somebody who's very different and yet the person you know. And what is to know them then?
Okay, great. Perhaps we can open up the floor now. I'm aware of the time, but if people would like to stay, and if Mandy is happy to carry on, it seems to me a shame to interrupt the flow of the conversation. So if people would like to participate, it would be great. Are there any questions or thoughts? Well, perhaps I could just bring one question then, which Tim would have asked, except that security has popped by, which sounds like a Chaplin film in itself. And he was asking about the reprise of the Drunk Millionaire sequence in Sinclair's The Jungle. Mandy, is that something that you could respond to?
Say again, the reprise of what sequence?
Of the Drunk Millionaire sequence in particular.
I didn't realize that that was reprised in The Jungle, and I've just been looking at The Jungle for another project. I'll have to. Where does that occur? Can you enlighten us?
Well, I can't, unfortunately, and our questioner has left the building.
I'll certainly check that out. I've been looking at The Jungle because I'm interested in the diminution of Jurgis Rutkus, the central character, who's a Lithuanian immigrant who's almost literally shrunk by his experience of working in a meat packing factory in Chicago. But I haven't read all of the book, and I haven't run across the Drunken Millionaire sequence. I can tell you, and going back to John's point about comedy, that the one sequence for me, and for the students that I used to show City Lights to, it wasn't a very funny film. And I personally think the gags in the circus are much better timed and much more complex and interesting. And I find the comedy, and so did my students, they just yawn through the comedy. I could try to get them interested in the pathos up to a point, but they not a squeak would they admit during the comic sequences. But there's one comic sequence which for me is totally money in the bank, and this is just to completely switch off the interesting question from Tim, which I'll just have to come back to, which is the one where the drunken millionaire suddenly steers his rolls onto the sidewalk around 3 lampposts and then straight into the traffic, I think, at Sunset Boulevard, and to the oncoming traffic in the opposite direction. And Chaplin's, the tramp, says, "Careful with your driving." And the millionaire raises his arms from the wheel in surprised exclamation and says, "Am I driving?" That, for me, is the best drunk driver joke in human history, and the funniest, one of the funniest jokes in Chaplin's entire works. It's just brilliant, but it's not really a slapstick joke. It's a verbal joke, actually. It's a kind of, you could imagine that in a very conventional stage drama or stage comedy. It's all forms of drunken misbehavior, and Chaplin certainly gets involved in lots of those in his own routines, can be funny, but this is funny because it isn't physical, really, except in the sense that removing your hand from the wheel as you're steering into the opposing traffic might be seen as physical. And that intrigues me, that the verbal element in the film comes to the fore there in the comedy. For me, the film is a very stark parable. I mean, the points that John raised about the parable of somebody acquiring riches, really wanting riches and acquiring riches, is to the fore for me more by the parable structure than by even the theme of acquiring riches. And it's lit. It doesn't have, I mean, unlike The Circus, which almost feels like a documentary film when you go back to it after this, it's got very little depth of focus. It uses extras, but not in a very interesting way, so we don't look at them very much. It's very, the lighting is very shallow, and the framing is the definition of the space is very shallow. Yeah, it feels like a very elegantly designed parable. And one of the things Ivor Montague said about it was that Chaplin over-edited it. Ivor Montague watched him edit the famous, supposedly good gag where the tramp is beholding the naked statue in the gallery and pretending to be an art connoisseur so he can justify just staring at it for several minutes. And in order to show himself as a connoisseur, he tries to step backwards as though he's rethinking it, reframing it, and so forth and so on. And each time he steps backwards, a shaft opens that's there to deposit things, and he nearly steps back into it 3 times. And the Montague thought he overworked that. I mean, I think there's a claim against City Lights as the perfect Chaplin film in some ways because of things like this. But it is a brilliant, 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 brilliant parable of gratitude and the gift. A rather worrying one, actually, if you think about it. If you want gratitude, yeah, you're not going to get it. Yeah. It seems to be a very strong message. The gift absolutely has to be given in respect to no expectation of mutuality. But what Ricoeur says is the right receiving will set up the right attitude towards getting anything, which is not to imagine having to repay it exactly, to somehow move yourself out of a pact of exchange value into an absolute relation of openness to intention, I suppose, would set up the possibility to give that gift with no expectation the other way either. But it's quite an extraordinary sequencing of the typical relation. No.
Would anyone like to respond to that?
I am mindful that everybody's spent all day on Teams already. Yeah.
We're just building for this. So
I just a really simple comment. The gag when he nearly falls down the hole. He sort of reprises it in modern times where he's roller skating and he keeps getting nearer the edge, but he can't see it. Yeah, and that really does have you on the edge of your seat, and it somehow works a lot better.
Yes, well, there's something about modern times and the use of the gears and the industrial machinery that makes you think that people were really risking their lives to shoot the film, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. It does. You know, how many people were injured in the making of Modern Times? You know, everybody, I would have thought. You know, it's scarier. It's much scarier than The Circus, which is very interesting because the circus is supposed to be about, you know, feats that would frighten you. Yeah.
Can I just ask a question just about the extraordinary ending, Mandy? And it's prompted in a sense by what Danielle was saying and emphasizing the sort of the staged nature of the touching as well. But just how you formalize things. I mean, you're going through binaries and reversals brilliantly, I think, in your chapter, which include Chaplin himself as director and actor, and us as viewer, knowing about Chaplin, and also clearly things that are in the in the news at the time, and what Chaplin might be doing, perhaps trying to redeem himself in this film in some way, in these different sort of reversals that you talk about. But it was just that the way that you formalized things at the end, in terms of the flower of generosity and the coin in that second stage, as equivalence and credit. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about that. I mean, the flower girl. I mean, presumably we're still dealing with types here. I mean, everything is a type. It's generic. There's no symbolic status to this particular flower. I can't tell what that flower is. It seems to be white, but you didn't emphasize this particular symbolic nature of that. But nevertheless, you do formalize things symbolically in terms of working through recur and the notion of justice and agape, bringing in then to this idea of another binary you're proposing of love, delight, generosity, and justice. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I found that very, very interesting.
Okay, well, let me just get the relative page to reprise that a little bit more specifically. For those of you who pay attention to the text, it's on 68, I guess, something like that.
I think it's in your final part of the chapter, isn't it? In that last section.
That last. Ricoeur argues that there's justice, which makes arguments, and a kind of love, which he calls agape. It's a love of friendship. It's not necessarily that it couldn't involve, I think, a romantic love, but it would. But what he's concerned about is that the demand in romantic love for fidelity and the sense of that if your partner in a romantic relationship abandons you or even goes away for a while, you can feel privation. Whereas with friendship, he says, there's an abiding sense that the world is better for this friend being there in such a way that you're not demanding constant attention from them or constant recognition from them. They are making the world better by sheer being there. Yeah. Now, Ivor Montague is dealing with Chaplin's diminished reputation by the time he writes these things about him, and I don't know the extent to which he's thinking about the allegations of abuse of his various women partners. Or not, or how seriously Ivor Montague would have even taken those claims. But there is an argument that he makes that Chaplin's gift to the world is so great that you can't make a calculation based on he was good in this respect but not good in this respect that you might make in other circumstances. And he talks about love transcending that. That's it. You know, you're so pleased, in Ricoeur's terms, you're so pleased this person exists in the world that you're not making any claims on them beyond that in some sense. Now, I have to say, I wrote some of this and was thinking about it at a time when I was going through a very bad and still unresolved relationship of friendship. Yeah. And I've often hoped that that person might read this chapter, but then it occurred to me that what I was doing was trying to exculpate myself, and that maybe that was just what she'd expect, and she'd be still angry with me. for sort of claiming that without beyond everything else, I'm still lovable. So just go with me, and that really wouldn't work. I'm supposed to be thinking about she is the person who makes the world better by what I'm trying to think, by her sheer existence. But I suppose that the opposition is an opposition of prose and poetry, I think refers to. I refer to it as the critic and the scholar, if you like. The scholar I refer to is the German who says he wasn't that popular. Look at the statistics, blah, blah, blah. City lights didn't work that well, et cetera, et cetera. Here are the reasons I think why. And you have the critic, and the critic, I suppose, would be Krakauer in this case, saying, look what he's done. He's fantastic. He has a relation to all classes, to all nations, to all generations that is different from other artists, and it's quite extraordinary. And this is what a statement of celebration, not a statement of calculation. And those are the oppositions. Now, if you take the flower as the figure of beauty, poetry, celebration, and the coin is the coin of criticism, analysis, calculation, you would, I don't know, probably vote for the flower, those of us who are sitting here. Although we're also conducting a discussion that might be closer to the coin of calculation in the way that we're trying to specify things and de-specify other things, or attend to things or challenge things. If you want to get really cynical about it, you might remember that Chaplin had just gone through a very big fight with the American government about the back tax he owed. Maybe he's trying to urge them to play down the coin of calculation for his own benefit, because he had not only that, but a 900,000 in the days when that was a lot of money, divorce settlement for his second wife, who claimed he'd abused her. Yeah. So the coin of calculation is also on his mind. And as he told Ivor Montague, if he came out wrong with his tax appeal and his divorce settlement, he wouldn't be able to make any more films. Yeah.
Well, the fact you leave, the film is left unresolved, and you leave also that kind of binary unresolved, I think is excellent. I think that's how it should be. I'm going to just pass to Eric, who has asked a question. Well, he can ask it for himself. Eric.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi, Mandy. Thank you very much. Fantastic
Thanks.
paper. So many things going around my head at the moment. But you said early on, you've made a brief reference to the role of sculpture in the film. Yeah. And you just alerted me to the ways, and some of the ways, obviously, I'm just sort of trying to start thinking about this, but you alluded to the first scene where we see the tramp and he's nestling in the hands of this large sort of maternal sculpture, and then of course he goes on to sit on the hand of another of the trio of sculptures, and then I think speaks into a hand of another. And then curiously in the scene with the bronze nude sculpture in the window, he's wearing gloves, which I think is the only scene in the film, apart from the boxing, of course, where he's, his hands are covered, and our attention is drawn precisely to the gloves by a boy who removes the finger from the index finger of the glove, and it just got me thinking, what are we being told here about the role of touch and tact and the tactile? And I'm thinking Freud, what he says in about the role of touch in the joke, and is there something there, or am I reading way too much into this? But that's a roundabout way of saying I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on the role of sculpture, because it seems to me that there is something, there's potentially a whole, maybe it's a rabbit hole irrelevant thoughts, but
well, thank you. I hadn't observed. I really appreciate your close attention to the other. It's true. There's a whole configuration of statues in the early monument, and he gets caught in them and so forth and so on. But I hadn't thought about the hands or the boxing gloves or the removal of the tip of his ragged glove. So thank you very much. Sculpture more broadly interests me in terms of melodrama, if you want to hear me out about that, because Rousseau's Pygmalion he claims that as the first melodrama, and he was talking about a particular kind of combination of music and declamation alternating rather than sung dialogue in an opera, because he thought French wasn't a good language for sung dialogue. Yeah, he was very interested in opera. He'd already composed one that was a court success, The Village Soothsayer, but he thought opera didn't really work in the French language. So he devised this idea of Pygmalion in a sculpture, not a king, in the 18th century conception of Pygmalion, in his studio, despairing of ever regaining his genius and then unveiling Galatea and falling down to worship his own artistry in her, and then she comes alive. And then there are very complicated questions of who is who. Speaking of recognition, is he recognizing himself in her? At one point, she touches herself and says me. At another point, she touches him and says me also. Yeah. And it's his heart. And there's this kind of potential romance, but it's, again, there's a kind of hold on black at the end of the short play. Well, the interesting thing about Rousseau's conception of that was the whole of 18th century France was preoccupied by Pygmalion. There were a number of sculptures of the sculptor kneeling at the feet of the figure who's rising and coming towards him in some way. There also were paintings of that. There also was Herder's book on sculpture plastique, claiming that the cool thing about the freestanding sculpture was you could embrace it. It was both independent and self-standing, but you could also put your arms around it, which is pretty much what Pygmalion wants to do in Rousseau's version, et cetera, et cetera. And what interests me about melodrama is the constant interpolation of scenes by moments of tableau, which make the cast into sculptures. Yeah. In stage melodramas, there'll be this moment of whoa, and everybody will stand still at a moment of revelation. Yeah. And at the same time that this device is being set up, well, it's being preceded in 18th century painting by notable celebs, Emma Hamilton, the most famous, but lots and lots and lots of Mrs. Siddons, another famous one, posing as a classical sculpture for a painter. So Mrs. Siddons becomes the muse of tragedy, say. Emma is configured in all sorts of ways as classical heroines by painters. And she herself had an act she called her Attitudes, where she would pantomime classical heroines in moments of ecstasy or distress or appeal. Yeah, in fact, she could go through using only a set of shawls and some lighting assisted by her husband, Sir William, in a kind of set of almost like blackout sketches, if you like, where she moves from character to character, pose for pose to pose. And then she was painted doing that as well. Yeah. So the sculptural as a moment of pose becomes a big issue in melodrama. And it takes you back to this idea of actual sculptures in these films. Yeah. And that's where I got interested in. So thanks for pushing me onto that. Yeah.
Thank you for that tremendously rich answer. Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, I wonder for any more final questions. I think the final question, if there is one, or thought.
I think we should let Eric's be the final question. I also like the way he's lit for this discussion, which is very artistic, I think.
Sorry about that.
No, I like it. I like it. It's more interesting than all the other backlights, which are all prefigured. Yeah. Can I thank you all for struggling out to do this on what must not be the best term of your existence. I can only say how pleased I am not to be teaching at the moment with you. But I would love to stay in the closest possible touch to the Center for Visual Cultures. I'm very grateful for your knowledge and your attention to my chapter. I really appreciate it. And the book, I think, should be in the library now in some electronic edition. Yeah.
Well, I put it on my reading list, Mandy. And I'll chase it up.
Thanks. I'm very obliged, since it costs more money than the Sculpture of Galatea. Yeah, at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, well, our turn to thank you, Mandy. Thank you so much for giving of your time so generously. I mean, and obviously to John and to Danielle for their responses, and for everyone who participated. It's been an excellent session, an excellent way to kick off our year of activities in the centre, and I'll definitely let you know what's on next.
Please, I'd love to see all of this. I'd love to hear all your papers. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, you will. Yeah. So on that note, thank you again, everyone, for coming, and see you again at the next Centre for Visual Cultures event. And this recording will be available through the website anyway. Give us a few days, but we'll sort it out.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and see you again soon.
Thank you again, Mandy.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers.